right. Hello, everyone, and welcome to another exciting episode of Adventures in DevOps. As always, I'm one of your hosts, Nell Shamrell-Harrington. Greetings from not Seattle this time, but Tacoma, Washington. And with me is my co-host, Scott. Scott, how are you doing?
Good. Doing great today. I'm coming from the lovely Bend, Oregon, where it's kind of warm here for a rarity. So
awesome. Good. Well, we have a interesting episode for you this week. After the show last week, we got together, wondered what should we talk about, and a subject that I think has been, hot on the minds of many people, or very much on the minds of many people, is the subject of monitoring. It seems like there's a lot of buzz about it. It seems like everyone agrees it's very, very important, but I think we need to break down a little bit on what it actually is and why it's important in a DevOps environment or in any technical environment.
Yeah, exactly. And it's funny because I'm kind of looking at I'm kind of cheating a little bit, and there's if you look in Mike Julian's book, Practical Monitoring, he has the kind of the middle chapters. It's monitoring business, front end monitoring, application monitoring, server monitoring, network monitoring, security monitoring. So that's like one of the best summaries I could have ever had on like what are all the different like levels at which you might need to do this monitoring. And so I thought that was really a great place to kind of like get us wrap some rigor around what we're talking about today, because there's just so many different things, right? And I know we've got a lot of discussion points in our document. So I don't know, what do you think, Nell?
I think it's great. Well, one thing I have noticed there's some confusion about is what's the difference between monitoring and alerting?
Yeah. So, wow, that's interesting. So monitoring system doesn't necessarily have to send a notification. It could just be literally just tracking data. It can be like triggering events that then maybe in something like an auto scaling group, increase the number of hosts that you have running, or scales any number of things, right? And so monitoring can do other things other than involve a human or just report information. And alerting, now this is Scott's definition, is typically meaning that you are going to send some kind of message, typically to a human, is I think what we tend to think, but that message could also go into some kind of a message queue that then gets run by some kind of functional programming app that triggers something else. There's any number of different ways that this could happen. So alerting and monitoring doesn't necessarily have to mean that something is going wrong in your application. Like if you have a really, if you're getting a lot of traffic to your website, maybe like that's a good thing. And it's like, oh, it's like a win, but let's like scale up the number of web instances we have, that kind of thing. So,
right. For me, monitoring is what you do to your system. It's monitoring is how you monitor is what I want to say, but it's how you keep insight into what your system is doing and how you gain the information, whether the system is doing a good thing or doing a not so good thing. As far as alerting, I think alerting is something that can result from monitoring, but it's not monitoring itself. I tell people the story sometimes about the time I was on call and I got paged at 10 p.m., 2 a.m., 4 a.m., and 7 a.m. For what it turned out were just ephemeral things in our infrastructure that were cleared up by the time I got myself out of bed and logged on and took a look. So that for me is alerting is the thing that wakes me up and my spouse in the middle of the night is what I often think of it as.
Well, it's funny because we might, if we were to go back and reinvent that, the regular use of that word, it might be better to call it, like events or something like that, right? Because now, like I think my default, like I said, association is to think you're getting a text message, a page back in the day. Maybe there are still people with pagers.
My pager's my cell phone now, but yes.
Yeah. So, events instead of alerts, maybe. But yeah.
Awesome. And then so where does logging come into monitoring?
I mean, for me, what you're doing is you're logging that information so that you have some history, so that if you need to look at performance or security or, I said performance and security. What else would be something that I don't know. You're using that to be able to go back and it's the functional equivalent of like having a videotape in a bank where you're like being able to look at something after the fact and use as evidence or to figure some problem out, right?
Right. Yeah, I think of it as logging is my application or the components of my application telling me what they're doing at any given time. And there's two types of logs I found. One is structured, and that's often in JSON or YAML, where you have a key, like CPU percentage, let's say, and then there's a value for that, which makes it really easy not easy, but it makes it possible to program an interface on top of it or to query it and get more information that way, or get exactly the information you need at any given time, versus unstructured logs, which I have also dealt with quite a bit, where I think it's more meant to be read by human than machine, though I find them less readable than structured ones. But I remember I used to work on an application where we had 4 different VMs running it. And I would open up a Tmux window, open up a shell session into each of those 4 servers, and try to see which one, or if we were seeing errors, try to see which server it was occurring on by watching all 4 of them at the same time. Now that makes my head hurt. It still makes my head hurt, particularly when we have infrastructures of things like hundreds or thousands of containers. So I think log collection is a good thing to bring up in this case, as a way of, I think most applications, maybe not most, but a lot of applications of any sort of significant size are running on multiple pieces of infrastructure now. And it's way easier to figure out what's going on by having the logs in one place versus having to do a bash shell into every system and try to see which one it's showing up on.
And in the structured logs are at some level a response to the fact that scale has become a big problem to manage. And so you need to like kind of make it somewhat easy to be able to bring all of this together into some kind of unified interface, in scale, if I'm going to use some kind of buzzwordy thing, right? Right. And I mean, I have to imagine that everything, we're logging to a flat file that are unstructured. That was purely just like, well, it's like the simplest, fastest way, back in the day when we're talking about like sub gigahertz processors and really slow hard drives and all kinds of stuff. I mean, and then what's happened is you have this legacy in all these applications, the Apaches and, basically any kind of web thing is where my mind default goes to this, right? Is we have all this legacy of these types of systems because they're just so easy to do and so reliable. And so now instead of replacing the default with something that's more structured, like you're talking about, now we're doing this thing where we're like aggregating logs and shipping them over to something and then storing them in long term and all kinds of things. So
yeah, it kind of feels like I feel like I'm what's the thing? Pan gold mining, the thing where they have the flat surface and they bring up water in it and then kind of swirl it around to see if there's gold in it. That's what it feels like sometimes, trying to parse unstructured logs at the very least. Hoping that the little nugget of gold or little nugget of information that I need will make itself known to me.
Yeah, and then you start getting, especially when you're using log aggregation, one of the things I often worry about is like, is everybody reporting all of their log information as well? It's like, then you gotta you have to have some monitoring to then make sure that all these systems are reporting this information back to this central system. And how do you, who watches the watchers, that kind of thing. So.
Right. So something I find, there's a lot of monitoring tools out there. There's a lot of different components you can use in monitoring, but I find there's 2 main different types of monitoring software. One is Pull, P-U-L-L. It's summertime, so I was thinking P-O-O-L for a second there, but no, P-U-L-L, Pull as in pull something. And that's one where there's some service, some sort of central service that is requests each remote node that's being monitored to send data about itself. And I believe that's the agent model.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And then push, by contrast, means every single thing that you want to monitor just pushes its data to another location. So that can be Datadog, that can be some other service, but the client itself, it knows where it's supposed to send the data, and it just sends it there, rather than waiting for the central service to request that they send it there.
Yeah, and syslog would be an example of something that is push, where it's like you configure your app to say, send to this endpoint, and that endpoint just sits there and just accepts everything, right? So, I mean, it's funny because even something that does like a Nagios check where you're checking up port 80 on a server, that is essentially some form of, is that, well, I don't know. Now I'm like questioning myself. Is that a pull or push? What do you think?
Like a health check?
Yeah, health check. Yeah.
I think that is, I'm cheating and looking at my highlights from Mike Julian's book. I think that one is a
pull.
Yeah, it is.
It's a pull. Yeah. It's like I'm like talking, so I can't even stop to think for a moment. So
it's all right. It's all right. So yeah, that is pull, and that's a classic one. I mean, that's the first thing when I set up a piece of infrastructure, that if it was a web application that I would usually set up, just query the health endpoint and find out whether it's working or not. And if it's not, let me know.
I mean, that's at the core of like AWS's, auto scaling and everything. It has multiple health checks, but that's one. Like if that fails, it just, it takes that one out of the pool for the load balancer. So,
So I guess another question we could go to is, what should you monitor? And I think this is highly dependent. I think the first question you should ask is, how do I know whether what does working mean? Does that mean users are able to access the home page of my application? Does that mean the CPU utilization is under a certain amount? What does working mean, and what indicates my whatever it is not working the way I expect it to?
What does working mean? I think you're trying to like think about like what's kind of like the most high level simple thing first. And so you would, if assuming you have just like, if you're monitoring from an external source, so like what we had talked about with monitoring, like is this web app up? You start at that high level, right? And obviously, if you have multiple domains, then maybe you're monitoring each domain that is maybe served by that same application. So like in the example of like, your marketing site is www and your application is app. Whatever the domain is, right? And so you're kind of looking at each of these things, but what's happening is you can't, from the external sense, you are not monitoring. You can't monitor individual pieces of that application, and so you're monitoring on the server level. And I think, as some of this is, you try to like, if you don't know where to start, you Google and try to find some best practices. But typically, I would say like make sure that you are monitoring anything that is core, so to speak. So web instances, databases, caching systems, like what happens when those caching systems go down, building failover into that. I mean, I guess I'm getting off the monitoring topic some level, but, like what are all the core pieces? And you start by monitoring those. And then, obviously you need to monitor on things that could run out of resources. Like if you're saving things to S3, you never need to monitor how much you're storing in S3. But you do have to monitor how much memory are you using in your Redis cache, or how much, I don't know, obviously databases stored in the cloud, you're not having to worry about how large is the database getting. It's something that's very much a secondary resource. But, I would say you kind of look at those first functional things and then dig into what services are important on my server and look at those individually. And then, I don't know, my typical feeling is not to try to optimize for stuff that's not in like your knowledge view at the moment. Don't go super deep unless you know that you need this, because what happens is every time you add something, you're adding like monitoring memory on a server or RAM on a server when you don't need to monitor those things, creates like some kind of technical debt or some kind of noise that distracts you. So sorry, I knew that was a long talk. Go ahead, Nell.
No, it's all right. I mean, when I was first getting started with monitoring my infrastructure, when I grew beyond one piece of infrastructure, I wanted to have a room where it's like mission control, basically, for NASA, and I envisioned having all these monitors, and we had some of them in the office, monitoring the CPU, monitoring the memory usage, etc. We put them up; they look really cool for visitors. It didn't really give us. It very rarely gave us something of value. Yeah. It was something where if disk usage is one I've had to watch, partly because of logging. Before centralized logging or exporting your logs was really common, it was easy to run out of space on the disk of your infrastructure just from the logs getting too big or getting too much historical data in them. So I think we all want to be mission control, but I think it's important to figure out what metrics indicate whether or not your users are having a good experience, and then prioritizing those. What should we wake someone up in the middle of the night for, and what can probably wait until morning.
Yeah, your story made me think about, so when I worked at I'll just say a big sports team or a big sports business, I was this is corporate internal IT monitoring, corporate network monitoring, and like we used SCOM, which is System Center Operation Manager, and it was literally this thing that was pulling all this. It had agents, so it was pulling all this information, pulling up every event log, and it was just pulling in like thousands of things every day. And so much of it was just noise. And and we spent hours and hours and hours looking through this every day. And it just seemed like, even while we were doing it, it just seemed like there was, I don't know, I didn't feel like we had a lot of good solutions, because we were supposed to look at all this stuff and we were allowed to set up rules and stuff. But at the same time, there was just thousands of different crazy errors that had like nothing really actionable to it. And gosh, I mean, if it's not really actionable, I mean, we all have so many things to do. Like, why just create a bunch of work that's not really valuable? I just didn't, it just boggles the mind sometimes.
Right. And this might be going off topic just slightly, but I'll bring it back right afterward. So when deciding what to wake someone up for or not, I often think of the story. My wife was an intern at a law firm a couple of summers ago, and their database went down one day, but their only system administrator was literally at her mother's funeral. They did not call her in that case. They were in the position, fortunately, where they could just shut down business for the rest of the day and then have her deal with it the next day when she came back. But I think we metrics, it seems so machine-like, and we get so excited about it, but we remember there have to be humans who respond to this, and what's worth a response and what's not.
Yeah, definitely. Hugely important.
Right. So also in Mike Julian's book, which, as our listeners may have picked up, that's the book we read in preparation for this episode, partly because he's a friend of Lee's. And I found it interesting because it's not uncommon for technical books to give anti-patterns and patterns. That's or patterns and anti-patterns. That's really useful. But he started with the anti-patterns. And I think for something as nebulous as monitoring, what do I monitor when I can theoretically monitor 10,000 things? I think it's good to have an idea of what not to do. And I remember the first one he listed was tool obsession. And I honestly think we've gotten more into this since we started getting a lot of swag at tech conferences, which is the point of giving out swag. A company wants you to remember them. And if you have a t-shirt for some monitoring service, and you're in a meeting saying, all right, what should we use to monitor our systems? You got to notice the t-shirt or the mouse pad or something. But one of the things Mike highlights is that what works for one company may not work for you necessarily. If it's different, different technical domains and different business problems.
Yeah. Yeah. See, a tool obsession. It's kind of funny because I would say so I spent my first 10 years working in corporate environments. And there was a large number of web apps that I managed, but oftentimes I spent so much time on, like I said, things like systems. And a lot of times in the Windows world, like there's just like you use Microsoft stuff and it's kind of like the default, like I said, using System Center Operations Manager. And a lot of times the management would have been so much easier using, like a dozen different tools. And I totally have been in environments where I just didn't understand the extra cost and complexity of the monitoring tools that were implemented when there wasn't like, I feel like a lot of it was just kind of like drop in and like, hey, here, we're going to use this monitoring tool because we need to monitor things and we need to have, and it was because none of it was really, at least as a user, it wasn't attached to some, hey, we're trying to meet some kind of compliance. And so we're going to be like auditing something and we need to like, so we can present a report to auditors or something. None of that was like driving that so that we picked this tool. It was just kind of like, oh yeah, Microsoft has this tool or whatever. And, I don't know. It's always been interesting to see how there's not a lot of time given to like what's really important to the business and the checkbox monitoring, which is something he actually mentions as the anti-pattern of just, hey, I can monitor all these things, but should I even do it?
Yeah. And as you mentioned, there are environments like highly secure environments or such where you do literally have a checklist that you have to meet. I remember I was on site with a contractor who worked in the national security space, and we'll leave it at that. And one of the engineers on my team almost got into a fight with one of the engineers on their team about encryption algorithms. And we finally had to take aside the engineer on my team and say, okay, it's not about which one is superior. He literally has a checklist that he needs to show they're using one of these algorithms. So I mean, and I'm sure they have that for monitoring as well. So if you're in a highly secure environment like that or any highly regulated environment, yes, you might have to use a checkbox. But if you're not, it's not, again, we've talked about signal to noise, and with monitoring, it's especially important not to have noise that you don't need. There'll be plenty of stuff with signal in it.
Yeah. No, it's totally.
Go ahead.
I don't know. Is there any specific tools that you think are worth discussing?
Nagios is the most common one, and that's honestly probably the one that I have the most experience with. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of documentation on it and a lot of use cases, which does make it useful. But I do know when I go to tech conferences and I say I'm using Nagios for something, I get judged. I'm not
cool anymore. It's too old.
I know, exactly.
Or something, right?
And then I want to tell them that I use Vim and see their reaction on that. But what about you? What monitoring tools do you think are worth discussing?
I think if you're on AWS or you're, whatever cloud you're in, I think you should use their default monitoring tools first. Mm-hmm. If you're moving, I would not lift and shift my monitoring without like strongly reevaluating what the purposes of those kinds of things are. My general sense is that, there's this kind of almost obsession in some organizations about having multi-cloud. And so then they don't want to get entrenched with using any of the cloud tools. But the thing is that if you use the cloud tools, they've built this like really beautifully tight integration where, this error occurs, and then and it creates an event, and this event then can trigger 15 other things or one other thing or whatever you want. Like I keep bringing up the idea of auto scaling, right? And so hey, let's add another instance or keep adding instances or shut down bad instances or whatever that is. And I just think that there's that stuff is so tightly coupled, and there's no, I mean, there's the configuration has to be like a tenth of the amount of time. And then you scale that by the number of times that you do those configurations. So if it's 10% as much configuration work, and you do this 50 times or 500 times or 5,000 times, it really scales. And obviously it's best to be doing these things with configuration management tools, using the chefs, the puppets, the Terraform, whatever you're doing to kind of configure stuff. But I mean, I just think that there's so many beautiful advantages of using native cloud, stuff that I don't know. It's just crazy, because if it saves, like I see these studies, and I've never experienced this personally, but I see these studies where they talk about how, when you move things to the cloud and you really focus on automation and stuff like that, that it literally reduces headcount, and it increases the number of servers that each person can manage. And, so I'm not like, don't believe me, believe what's been done by studies and things like Nicole Forsgren. What is that thing called? Accelerate. Thank you. I had it on my desk until like this afternoon, and then I took it off. So, yeah.
I took a picture of my pet bunnies sitting by that book and sent it to her with the caption "Data Bunnies." I think they nibbled at it, so I took it away. But yeah, that one applies the science, very rigorous. I mean, Dr. Nicole Forsgren is a doctor of philosophy or information science, and it applies the science to it, which is pretty cool to see.
Yeah. And I mean, I think she said the survey was done by 50,000 different people, I think, or something like that. So it's a significant thing. And for there to be bias in the information, there would have to be structural, cross industry, cross world, like, everybody's trying to scam this thing. And so I don't, it's going to be a pretty good source of information on what's going on in the world, I think. So, and there's other people that have done like significant research around how automation saves you time, among other things.
Another anti-pattern, which made me laugh a little bit, because we are a DevOps podcast, and the idea of monitoring as a job. Because I mean, sometimes you hear a lot saying, you DevOps should not be someone's job. It should be something, shared by the entire organization. And I think with monitoring, it's similar. I think it's common, especially in big companies, to get in a situation where we have a team, or at that team's the monitoring team, and they apply all the monitoring to all of our applications. The problem, as we mentioned before, is it's the people who write the applications that probably will know what the most valuable metrics or most valuable things to monitor are, because they know how the application works. And they're going to know what indicates the application is not working the way it should.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and they're more likely to be able to make those, hey, we should try to monitor this thing. They're as I'm fixing bugs and this and that, they can be like, hey, if we might want to monitor some particular part of the application, because I think this is something of concern. I don't have a good example off the top of my head. I'm trying to think of, I don't know, long running tasks or that kind of thing. I mean, yeah.
Awesome. And then let's see here. Another one he lists is using monitoring as a crutch, and I have experienced this personally. I mean, the classic example that comes to mind is monitoring the CPU usage on a system, because there's some processes that are draining the CPU on it that we don't know what they are. So we just get an alert when the CPU reaches a certain percentage, and then we reboot the system, and it's okay for a while. That happened on Apollo 11, come to think of it. They had some processes that were eating memory, and they had to keep rebooting the computer. People have been trying turning it on and turning it off again, and it worked in that case since the 1960s. But yeah, it's using it as a way, short term, sometimes you have to do that, but long term, if you're using it as a way to make up for a not well architected code or infrastructure, it's way better in the long run to go and fix the code or the infrastructure that's causing it.
Yeah, and I mean, it's funny because I was actually like literally thinking of an example of the exact same thing, where Java application using too much memory, reboot the machine, and that is I think that is an acceptable short-term thing. If you're like, well, we don't have budget or we don't have resources to fix this and like really rewrite this or whatever you want to call it. In some instances, I read something earlier today where I think this was on Twitter. Somebody had shared something on Twitter where there was literally some web service that it was written in Java and nobody knew where the source code was for it. And so they had statically entered somebody's email address. And so they couldn't do anything about it. So they just had to leave that system in place until they got resources to fix it. So it's kind of crazy.
Right. I once was working on a project where someone had set up this application on Heroku. No one knew who set up the Heroku account, whose account it was. Eventually what we did was we migrated it to another account that we knew we had control of, and then pointed the DNS at that new one and just let the other one sit there until whoever set up the account got the notice that they needed to pay for it, or until it eventually got shut off.
Wow. Yeah, that's crazy. Yeah. And I mean, it's funny because I don't know if I mentioned this, but I think I briefly mentioned it, but because this literally happened to me a couple of years ago where I realized, we've at different times had apps on Heroku, and at one point Heroku changed. They used to offer like free backups. I don't know what it was. It was like a weekly backup and like a 7-day daily backup. Eventually they just killed that. And I either was like off the mailing list or something like that, and I just had no clue. And so I somehow was checking in this kind of manually, and I realized that we didn't have a backup for a long time. I don't remember how long it was, but it was something that I was like, oh my God, I can't believe that I didn't have some kind of better system in place for making sure that this was happening. So yeah, it's crazy. Mm-hmm. And it's funny. So one of my favorite things I did, one of the projects that I did was around BCDR, business continuity, disaster recovery stuff. And it's something that I see, especially on small companies, really neglect this process of actually restoring data. And I'm getting totally off the monitoring topic at this point, but it's like restoring your databases and making sure things actually work. And it was just something that was a really valuable experience for me. But I'll get back on the monitoring game here a little bit.
I do remember, I don't remember who it was, but at a conference I heard someone say, maybe even Adrian Concroft at HashiCorp, having a disaster recover data center or having a failover data center that you've never actually failed over to is just a waste of money. Mm-hmm. It's true. Yeah. But we can do, I think we should do an episode on just disaster recovery.
Yeah, definitely. I have a lot to share or discuss about, at least on that. So,
yeah. But in the meantime, the last anti-pattern Mike listed was manual configuration, which yes, if you need to manually configure your monitoring every time you spin up a new system or change the system, it's gonna get forgotten. Mm-hmm. It's a step that's gonna be missed, and then you won't have the benefit of monitoring that system because it won't be working the way it's supposed to.
Yeah, and it would, maybe you slightly configure it wrong, or there's all kinds of ways that you could screw it up by manual configuration, right? So you just forget stuff.
Right. Well, we've talked about some anti-patterns. Now let's talk about some patterns. And one he mentioned, which was really interesting to me, was composable monitoring. The idea that you don't have just one monitoring solution you use for all your systems, but you have different pieces of monitoring software that maybe you monitor different things that you can then compose together to get that meaningful picture of your system at any given time. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so an example of that would be you're using PagerDuty to do external checks and Nagios to do internal checks, right? So that's a easy example.
Right. One I think I've used was we used New Relic for application level monitoring. It was for a Rails application, and if that was throwing errors, they would go to New Relic, and I think we had PagerDuty wired up to New Relic, and it would alert us on that when we needed to look at it. But we used a Datadog for information about our infrastructure itself. Mm-hmm. And that was a combination that worked well for that particular application's need at that particular time.
Yeah, and I don't mean to imply that PagerDuty can't do more than external monitoring. I was just trying to say, hey, this is one way that right? You're piecing these things together. So, yeah.
Right. And then the other one, I think we've discussed this, other monitoring pattern is monitoring from the user perspective. And what I think of is, I think, I don't remember the calculation, but for however many milliseconds Amazon.com is down, how much money they lose. So they really want to know if a user's clicking on Amazon and it's not working, or they're trying to check out and it's not working. The users are the ones driving the revenue for them, and they want to know when a user is having a bad experience first.
Yeah. And that, and that is essentially application performance monitoring, right? And so that's looking at, it's attempting to sample some subset of the traffic, maybe on a specific host or on the site as a whole, or on some service, that's running in that, like login service or checkout service, right? And then you're trying to use the sampling to tell you, hey, are things getting better? Or things getting worse? Are we staying within some acceptable range? Yeah.
Right. And then the next one he wrote, which I heartily agree with, is the idea of buy, not build. As engineers, we love to build things, and it's really tempting when when we see a technical problem to think, oh, well, I can come up with my own solution that will work perfectly for us, and we'll maintain it, and it'll be great. I think unless you're at like Google writes its own monitoring software, most likely, which is fine. And they make some of them available as open source projects. But if it's not your core competency, usually you should buy the solution versus trying to roll your own, because it will never be less money to roll your own unless you're at massive scale, because you have to count in salary, count in maintenance time, count in time that's not going into whatever your core competency is. One of the questions I ask whenever I interview or when I'm interviewing for something is I always ask, do you build your, to pre-state, I always ask, do you build your own invoicing system? And if they do, and if they're not an invoicing customer, there's not a really good reason that they do. To me, that's a red flag, because those are you've got leap years and time zones, and those are ridiculously hard to manage. I think I might change that to monitoring, actually, if I'm interviewing for more infrastructure focused job. Do you write your own monitoring software? And there could be a good reason that they do, but I think that's rare, unless, again, you're at Google or Amazon size.
What made you, so you've used the question of, are you writing your own invoicing software before? Yes. You're saying, what made you decide that was the thing to use?
I worked at a company that wrote we were not an invoicing software company, but in the early days of it, someone had written invoicing software for them because they thought that would save them money. And it may have at that time, but every time we went from daylight savings time to standard time, it broke. Months are not consistent in their length at all. And leap years are a plague on invoicing software. So I remember how many years, I think man years, not just, or person years, not just person day hours or person days we lost to it. And that was not spent on the stuff that we actually were selling to the market. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. It's funny because it's like, I'm sitting here going, what were they like writing everything? Cause when I build stuff, I'm using all these nice, beautiful Python libraries that are obviously doing things at the back end side. And then on the front end side, the JavaScript, I'm using little JavaScript drop-in, date pickers and stuff like that. And so to me, I'm like sitting there going, what? How could, why are they even dealing with dates, man? That's like a problem that you just don't even want to go near.
Yeah, this was a place that had a severe case of not invented here syndrome, which that's an entire other episode we could talk about that. I think with the rise of SaaS services, that's starting to become less common. Because there are very well-known services that have, like at that company too, we wrote our own chat software. We didn't use a third-party chat system, which also broke a lot. And But anyway, the next pattern
Yeah.
he recommends
Just
is,
get off that topic.
yeah, let's get off that topic. The next pattern he recommends is continual improvements. And this one spoke to me a lot too, because with a lot of things, DevOps related or non-DevOps related, we'd like to think, okay, I've set up monitoring for my system, I'm done. Mm-hmm. It's never done. Mm-hmm. Because your application, your infrastructure changes as your business changes.
Yeah. I mean, this is so one of my favorite kind of books is High Output Management by Andy Grove. And one of the things, and I've been kind of rereading this in this last week. And one of the things he talks about how everything is a process, including the monitoring, right? I mean, like everything you do is a part of some process, and like when you're looking at things like your KPIs, whatever those are, like, so if you're keeping track of your site's uptime or how often you're pushing code and those types of things, I feel like as you're looking at those things and working to improve those and doing all these things, like the monitoring is just another process that's involved in helping you execute and kind of just manage that over that whole process. So I feel like it's, I don't know. It's funny because it just baffles me sometimes whenever I feel like, oh, we're just done with that. We don't have to mess with that anymore. And sorry, I'm just kind of like babbling at this point, but
no, that's all right. I understand that there's so many things, and I think the DevOps movement in particular recognizes this. It's never going to be done. There's a lot of things it's never going to be easy. It can be easier, or it can be possible. I think that's the main part, and it can be easier than it was before. But I was chatting with someone recently about technology in general, and I said, all the easy technological problems are already solved. Mm-hmm. I wouldn't call it an old industry by any means, but I mean, the stuff that a really young industry could solve, with one person, or with, one person locking themselves in their basement for not a year, but for a month, and then coming out with this perfect solution to it. I think those problems have all already been solved. So now we're dealing with what happens next, the stuff none of us can solve on our own. Yeah. And that may never be completely solved, but we can continuously make it better. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Anything else we'd like to talk, or you'd like to discuss monitoring wise before we go to picks?
Security, I think, is something that is important. And I think I don't have a really great answer as to what specifically you should focus on monitoring, but I'm going to reinforce something that I shared as a pick, that the stuff that Amazon is doing with I'm trying to think what it's called, but they essentially are writing proofs that are things that allow you to do that are creating automated checks at scale. And you're seeing things, it's expressed in things like AWS config and AWS systems manager. And there's all these things that are in there that are kind of, it's a way of automating security, but it's also this way more sophisticated check than you're capable of doing with writing some script, because they're doing one of the things that they show on, if you watch some of the videos around it, and we'll add this to the show notes, is that when they actually have the ability, or they in the demo I show that they're doing an example of somebody actually writing code, and they're showing that, like, even as they're writing code, they're making mistakes on, like, at what point do you need to encrypt the data to keep the data encrypted and not be exposed or whatever. And so there's just a lot more to it than very simple kind of, and I mean, I think this is why we have security professionals, is because you can really dig way down. And I think it's really important to do that. But obviously you have to, with things like logging, a lot of times you have to make sure you're protecting those logs. and you have to do it in a way such that you can, if you are living in an industry where you have SOX compliance or HIPAA compliance or those types of things, you have to be able to prove that maybe that these logs have not been edited. And so you have to, so a lot of it's kind of funny because this is monitoring, but it's also like it kind of bleeds the edge, right? And I think that stuff is important, and it's not an easy thing to do, but it's something that's underappreciated. And but yeah, I don't know. That's what I got.
I love the idea of thinking of it as writing proofs.
Yeah.
Starting with defining what a good state is, or what a known good state is.
Mm-hmm.
Let's definitely add that to the show notes. I definitely would like to take a look at that demo myself.
I think it's called the automated reasoning team. But yeah, we'll get that automated reasoning group. So it's really, really, really interesting stuff. So.
Awesome. Well, we're starting to get near the end of our time. So let's move on to picks. One pick I have, I was in Berlin, Germany, and I could just pick the entire city of Berlin. It's glorious. But I was staying near Checkpoint Charlie, and I went to the Berlin Wall Museum at Checkpoint Charlie. And it's fascinating. It's a private collection, private museum. But one of the things that's really cool is they have all these little devices or ways that people try to smuggle themselves or smuggle other people from East Berlin to West Berlin back during the Cold War. And so there's cars with special compartments. There's suitcases where you can fit a child in. I think it only worked once, but there's a balloon that someone used to raise themselves off the ground and go over the wall and come back down. It's fascinating. And I recommend, if you go to it, give it at least half a day, because it was so fun to dig into not just all the artifacts they had, but also all the narration and writing around it. So highly recommend that. My other pick is the game Tetris 99 on the Nintendo Switch. This is Battle Royale Tetris, and it is awesome. The way you do Battle Royale in Tetris is every time you clear a row, you send it to someone else's board. So you've got 99 players it starts with, and slowly they eliminate each other until there's only one left. And it's absurdly fun. And it's a great way, if I just want to break for like 20 minutes or something, I can easily get in, if I'm not doing well, probably 4-5 games. If I am doing well, maybe 2. But it's way more fun than I ever would have expected it to be.
Nice. I like it. Yeah, I was actually in Berlin a couple of years ago, I guess it was like a year and a half ago. Yeah, it's really, really neat city to bounce around in. So are you just the 2 picks for you? You gonna do a third, or?
Just those 2 picks for me.
All right, cool. All right, so I definitely want to reinforce my pick of the automated reasoning, and I'm going to send there's like a blog, and then there's a video specifically with the head of the automated reasoning group, that Byron Cook, that I'll include in there. The other book, I've got a book I'm going to plug, and it's Atomic Habits by James Clear. This is somebody who's just been writing on the internet for, I don't know, probably better part of 8 years. Built like a really good following, and I've bought pretty much every course that he ever put out there. And it's just, he takes all of these books that are kind of being published out there about habits and, the way we work and our brain and all kinds of different things. And he kind of brings it all together into like some really digestible packages. And so one of my favorite tips that he gives around habits is that every action is a vote for the type of person we want to be. And so that means that if we're eating a cookie every day, we're making that vote for the type of person that eats a cookie every day. But if we then substitute it with a banana, then we're kind of slowly changing it. And habits are oftentimes like dozens or hundreds of different little small actions over and over and over again. And I think that's a really, really powerful thing. And another thing he does is he talks about how a lot of times if you want to build a new habit, it's easier to build the habit of showing up. So, he talks about this guy who was a customer of his that this guy just literally built the habit of like driving to the gym every day and like walking into the gym and spending like, I think 1 minute or 5 minutes at the gym. He didn't actually have to work out or do anything. It was just building the habit of like going there every day. And it's just a really powerful way to change behaviors that like, you don't even have to commit to doing anything like strenuous or difficult or painful or whatever you want to call it. It's just like you're building the habit of like going there. And once you can get yourself there, then you can either decide to do something or not, So I think I think he codifies a lot of really interesting ideas and really digestible, actionable ways. And so I think he's by far one of my favorite writers right now. So, and I will go ahead and give the other greatest hits writer. So Ryan Holiday, I pretty much am a big fan of everything he does, but specifically The Obstacle is the Way. And I think what he basically does is takes all of this Greek and, classical Roman philosophy and brings it into kind of the modern day. And he'll take these simple ideas and then pair them with somebody that's been alive in the last 200 years or so and show how they exemplify these actions. And I just think his stuff is super approachable. And like I was explaining to a friend of mine yesterday, there was this guy who was a young man, and when his parents died and some guy came in and like was managing his estate, so to speak, and like stole most of his money. And so whenever, he wasn't able to go to school. And so this guy spent his whole childhood, young adulthood, working on becoming a great orator and like doing things like giving a speech as he's running up a hill and sticking rocks in his mouth to give speeches. And he used this skill that this was somebody with a speech impediment and everything. And he used this skill to then go in front of a magistrate and try to argue his case to get back what's remained of his fortune. But in doing this, he became like one of Rome's greatest orators. And so there's just lots of really beautiful ways about like taking adversity and kind of turning it on its head or whatever. And, it's funny because I think I probably only faced really small adversity in my life, but I find the stories very powerful. So that's all I got picks wise. So that wraps me up for this week.
Awesome. Well, thanks, Scott, for being here. And thank you to our listeners. Lee is going to be out for the next month. He's got some stuff he's doing, but he'll be back in about 4 weeks or so. And in the meantime, it'll be the two of us and occasionally Chuck.
Yeah,
so,
maybe some interviews, hopefully. So
I hope so. Yeah. Awesome. Well, have a wonderful day, everyone, and take care.
All right. Thank you. Bye.
Bandwidth for this segment is provided by CacheFly, the world's fastest CDN. Deliver your content fast with CacheFly. Visit CacheFly.com.